The wind cuts hard across a shale ridge 9,000 feet above nothing. A girl stands alone on the bare stone, 19 years old. The tracks of 8 animals lead south without her, pressed clean into the soft dirt below the pass. Somewhere down that mountain, 4 men ride hard and laugh in the wind. She has a folding knife with a bone handle worn smooth as riverstone. She has a wool coat that belonged to her grandfather. And she has $11 folded flat inside the lining of her right boot. That is all. The ridge behind her is empty. The country ahead of her has no name on any map she has ever seen. Below the shale, the aspens turn silver in a wind that smells of coming snow. A hawk crosses the sky once and does not come back. The men who left her here counted her already dead. They did not know the country. They did not know the girl. They did not know the old man who had raised her, or the 8 winters he had spent teaching her exactly how to survive a moment like this one. In half a day's walk east in a ravine, no surveyor has ever set foot in a door, stands a quarter open on a drift of pine needles that has lain undisturbed for almost 2 years. Something has been waiting a very long time. Her name was Wren Callahan, and to understand what waited for her in that unmapped ravine, you have to understand first the shape of the life that carried her to it. She did not arrive at the top of that shale bench by chance. No matter what Rutherford Blake believed as he pocketed her wages and turned his pack strings south, she was not the soft, half-starved girl those 4 men from back east had counted her for when they measured her in the yard behind the assay office. She had been made, slowly, patiently, by 8 winters of hard weather, and by one old man who had loved her in the only language he knew how to speak. Settle in close tonight. Keep the lamp low. Let the wind outside your window match the wind that ran through those pines in the summer of 1886. Wren was born in a 2-room frame house at the edge of a lumber town called Beaver's Crossing. The sawmill ran 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. The whistle at dawn and the whistle at dusk marked out the whole shape of a working life. Her father, Callum Callahan, was a millwright who could listen to a shaft turning and tell you within a quarter turn where the bearing was starting to go bad. Her mother, Ruth, took in washing from the boarding house across the street, hung sheets on a line strung between 2 lodge poles behind the kitchen, ironed shirts on a plank table by the window until her wrist ached. For the first 9 years of Wren's life, she lived inside a small, quiet love that asked nothing of the world beyond wages on Friday, bread on the table, and Sunday's walks slow along the creek. In the winter of her 9th year, a fever ran through the men on her father's crew. Moving from bunkhouse to bunkhouse, the way a bad wind moves through dry grass, Callum Callahan took to his bed on a Tuesday, closed his eyes for the last time on a Sunday morning, and was buried on the hillside above the mill in the plot Ruth chose because it caught the first sun of the day. Ruth had never been strong. She kept the laundry going for 2 winters, kept Wren fed and clean and in her Sunday dress, kept the small house heated with wood. She split herself in the yard when she could still lift the axe. Then one bright morning in the spring of Wren's 11th year, Ruth simply did not rise from her chair by the window, and the neighbor woman who found her said afterward that she looked as though she had finally set down something very heavy. Wren stood in the parlor beside her mother's chair for a long time before she went next door for help. She did not cry. She did not know yet that this was strange. The letter came a fortnight later from a man Wren had never met, a man whose name she had heard spoken twice in her life, always with the same slow, careful respect. Her mother's father, Ezekiel Callahan, had ridden out from the high country to fetch her himself. He arrived at the frame house at Beaver's Crossing on a gray gelding, leading a second horse for her. He stood in the parlor with his hat in his hand and looked down at her the way a man looks at a stove he is not sure he knows how to light. Ezekiel Callahan was 63 that spring, a widower 19 years, a former Army scout who had ridden with the Union column through the mountain campaigns of 1863 and 1864, and had come home from the war changed in ways he never once spoke of. While he had settled on 80 acres of good ground above Silver Fork, run a small trap line for marten and mink along the creek that crossed his south fence, kept a handful of cattle when the market allowed, guided the occasional hunt for men from the eastern cities who paid in gold coin and asked no questions about what they shot or did not shoot. Zeke did not know how to comfort a child, and to his credit, he did not pretend he did. What he knew how to do from the first week Wren stepped down off that borrowed horse and stood in the yard of his cabin with her mother's Bible and a paper sack of clothes was teach. He taught without lectures, without praise, without any of the careful adult performance other children in Silver Fork were subjected to by well-meaning aunts. He simply started on the second morning, showing her how to skin a mink without cutting the hide, and he did not stop for 8 years. He taught her to read the weather in the way the aspens turn their leaves before a storm, silver undersides flashing all at once across a whole hillside. He taught her to walk on scree without breaking her ankle. Heel first, weight low and back, moving diagonally instead of straight down. He taught her to build a fire in the wind with wet wood, shaving down through the sodden bark to the dry heart of a branch, laying the shavings in the lee of a rock, striking one match instead of three. He taught her to shoot a lever-action rifle at 12, standing behind her the first time with his big steady hand on her shoulder. And by the winter she was 14, she was reloading her own cartridges by lamplight at the kitchen table, measuring powder into brass casings with a small scoop he had cut from a spent shell. By 16, she could pack a mule tight enough that the load did not shift on the switchbacks, dress an elk down to quarters in the field, find her way back to Zeke's cabin from any drainage within 30 miles of the ridge with nothing but the sun and the shape of the country to guide her. She could split a cord of firewood between breakfast and noon, ride a green horse through its first 3 weeks without getting thrown, patient and low in the saddle, letting the animal work out what she was asking. She could sit still in a stand of dark timber for 4 hours without moving, waiting for a bull elk to step out of the shadow, breathing so shallow her chest barely rose. Zeke gave her one thing in all those years that she came to love above every other object she owned. On her 17th birthday, a windless morning in April with the last of the snow melting off the north slope of the barn, he sat her down at the kitchen table, set a small canvas bundle in front of her, told her in a voice as level as a plank floor to open it. Inside the canvas was a folding knife, bone handle worn to the color of old cream, 3.5 inches of high carbon steel blade honed to a whisper of an edge, the whole of it no bigger than the palm of her hand. He had carried that knife strapped inside his coat through the winter campaigns of 1864. He told her it had crossed 3 rivers with him, cut the ropes on a wounded man's saddle at the second crossing, opened tins of army beef by lantern light in tents pitched on frozen ground. It had come home with him after the war and gone with him into the mountains, and now he said it was hers. A person who knows how to use a knife properly, Zeke told her, looking not at her face but at the blade lying open on the table between them, is never truly without a friend. She stitched a leather sheath for it that same evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor by the stove with a curved needle and a length of wax thread, and she carried the knife every day of her life after that. Each time her fingers touched the smooth bone, she thought of the man who had given it to her. There was one other night, she would remember it later, a night that mattered more than she knew at the time. The winter she was 16, late January. The wind had scoured the ridge bare of snow and driven what was left into drifts along the north wall of the barn. Zeke had come in from feeding the cattle at last light, hung his coat by the door, sat down heavy at the kitchen table with a tin cup of coffee. He did not speak for a long time. Wren was mending a torn place in her flannel shirt by the light of the window. She looked up once and saw him staring at nothing in particular. The way an old man stares when he is somewhere the rest of the room cannot follow him into. Then he said, quiet almost to himself, "There is a man somewhere I have never been able to find." Wren set the needle down. "Who?" "A stranger, from a long time ago." Zeke turned the cup slow in his hands. "He held something of mine for me, in the war. I told him I would come back for it." "Did you?" "I meant to." He looked into the coffee. "I looked. 20 years. I could not find him. I do not know if he is living or dead." "What did he hold?" Zeke was quiet a long moment. Then he shook his head. Small, final. The way he shut a door on things he did not mean to open again. "It is not your worry, girl. Sleep on it and forget it." She did not ask again. Zeke did not raise the subject a second time. But she remembered. She remembered the way his voice had gone soft on the word stranger. Like a man saying a name he had said in his own head 1,000 times and had never once said out loud to another soul. Ezekiel Callahan died on a warm Thursday afternoon in early May of 1886. Sitting in the ladder-back chair by the wood stove, a tin cup of coffee half drunk on the sill beside him, the front door standing open to a wind that smelled of new grass. Wren had been out at the woodshed when it happened, splitting kindling for the evening fire. She found him when she came back in with an armload of pine. He looked, she thought later, exactly the way a man ought to look at the end of a long day of honest work, which is to say he looked finished, and not sorry about it. She buried him herself on the rise above the spring, in a plot she chose because it caught the last light of the day, and she wrote to the address in his tin box the same evening. His only surviving brother was a man named Thaddeus Callahan, who lived 200 miles south in a valley Wren had never seen, whom she had met exactly twice in her life, both times as a child, both times briefly. Thaddeus wrote back within the month, a small neat hand that ran precisely level across the unlined paper. The 80 acres under the law as it stood passed to him. He was sorry for her loss. She was welcome, the letter said, to remain in the cabin until the sale of the property closed, but not beyond it. She was welcome to keep her personal effects. She was not welcome to any share of the proceeds, since she was in law no blood relation to the estate. She read the letter twice by the light of the window, folded it along its careful creases, placed it in the tin box on the mantel where Zeke had kept his papers, and went out to feed the chickens. The chickens still needed feeding, whether or not she had a roof over her head at the end of the month. She had learned from Zeke that when the news was bad, the first thing to do was the next chore. The sale closed in the second week of August. A land agent named Mortimer Craddock rode up the valley on a sorrel mare on a Tuesday afternoon. Leather satchel across his knees, bill of transfer folded inside it. He sat at Zeke's kitchen table, drank Zeke's coffee, explained to Wren in a small, neat voice exactly what she was permitted to remove from the property. Standing timber, the 2 remaining cows, the 4 hens, the roan mule, every stick of furniture Zeke had built with his own hands over 19 years, all counted as parcel, all staying. Mortimer allowed her the Bible her mother had brought north from Beaver's Crossing. He allowed her the tin box with Zeke's papers inside it. He allowed her the folding knife when she showed him it was on her hip and had been given to her personally on her 17th birthday. He allowed her the clothes she owned outright, 1 gray wool blanket from the foot of her bed, 1 iron skillet Zeke had bought her the year she turned 18, and the coat she had been wearing since April, which had belonged to Zeke himself and hung on her shoulders like a barn on a fence post. He allowed her, when she asked in a voice as level as the plank of the table between them, the small brass compass Zeke had kept in the drawer under the window. She told Mortimer it was engraved with her grandfather's initials and could reasonably be considered personal rather than inventory. Mortimer turned it over once in his palm, squinted at the letters ZC on the back of the case. He wrote it into the receipt without comment. He did not allow her the rifle. The rifle, he told her, holding it across his knees as though the weight of it were somehow her fault, was working inventory attached to the guiding trade. Zeke had run out of the property. It stayed with the parcel. He wrote out the full list of her permitted items, set the paper on the table, waited with his pen extended for her to sign. She signed it once without reading it a second time, slid the paper back. Mortimer finished his coffee, put on his hat, thanked her for her time as though she had done him a favor, rode back down the valley in the long, slanting light of a late summer afternoon. Wren stood on the porch until the sound of the horse was gone entirely, until she could hear again the wind in the aspens along the creek. Then she went back inside and began to fold her clothes into the same paper sack she had arrived with when she was 11. She slept that night on the bare boards of the floor by the stove. Since the bed frame and the tick were counted as inventory, she did not sleep well. She did not expect to. In the morning, she walked down the Long Valley Trail to Silver Fork with the bundle slung across her shoulder on a length of tarred twine, the folding knife in its sheath on her right hip, the small brass compass in the pocket of her grandfather's coat, and $11 in silver and paper folded flat inside the lining of her right boot. That was the whole of the money Zeke had kept in a battered coffee tin at the back of the pantry shelf. Mortimer Craddock, either through oversight or through some small private mercy he would never admit to, had not asked about the pantry at all. Silver Fork in August of 1886 was a town of dust and slow wagons and horses standing tied in the flat white sun in front of the assay office. The main street ran a quarter-mile between the freight yard at the north end and the livery at the south, and the wooden sidewalks under the awnings were warped in gray from 10 seasons of weather. Wren walked the length of it once with the bundle on her shoulder, looking for work the way a person looks for water in dry country, without hurry and without much hope of finding it in the first place. She asked at the boarding house first, since it was closest to the north end. The heavy-set landlady, a woman named Mrs. Beaumont, listened to her for perhaps a full minute before shaking her head and closing the door with a soft apologetic click. She asked at the freight office, where a clerk in a green eyeshade told her without looking up that they hired men for the wagons and women for the ledgers, and she did not appear to be either. She asked at the small hotel that Mrs. Beaumont's sister ran up the street, where a girl of about 15 sweeping the porch told her they already had 2 chambermaids and no room at all for a third. She asked at the mercantile, at the tin shop, at the barber's, at the saddler's, at the small kitchen behind the church where the ladies' aid served meals on Wednesdays. She asked with her back straight and her voice level, the way Zeke would have asked, and she was refused everywhere, with a courtesy that did not quite reach the eyes of the people refusing her. She slept, the first night, behind the livery. In an empty stall the hostler let her have for a nickel, laid the wool blanket on a fresh layer of straw, used the paper sack as a pillow, kept the folding knife inside the blanket where her right hand could find it in the dark. She ate a piece of yesterday's bread and a strip of dried beef she bought from a wagoner's wife on the corner. 3 cents together. She thought about the wind on the high ridge and the shape of the country north of town where Zeke had ridden with her twice as a girl. She thought about the small brass compass in her pocket and the way its needle had settled toward the door of the cabin every time she had held it flat in her grandfather's palm. She did not think about crying because there was no useful place in Silver Fork to do it. On the second morning, she washed her face at the horse trough behind the livery and walked the length of the street a second time. Asked again in the places she had asked the day before, in case anyone had reconsidered overnight. No one had. On the second afternoon, she sat on the shaded end of the mercantile porch and watched a pack string being loaded in the yard behind the assay office across the street. She counted the animals, read the shape of the loads, told herself without much conviction that the country north of town would still be there, whether or not she found a way back into it. On the third morning, the hostler at the livery, a lean gray man named Wick Brody, who had shod horses in Silver Fork for 28 years, came out of the office with a tin cup of coffee in each hand, held one of them out to her without speaking. She took it, drank half of it, standing. Listened while Wick told her in the roundabout way of a man who did not entirely approve of what he was passing along, that a party of 4 gentlemen from back east had ridden into town 2 days ago and were putting together an expedition into the high country to hunt bighorn sheep. Were looking for a camp hand who knew the drainages above the ridge. Were paying, he had heard, $4 for the trip. Wren thanked Wick for the coffee, set the cup down empty on the rail, walked directly across the street to the yard behind the assay office, where the pack string was being loaded, stood at the gate with her bundle at her feet and her hands folded in front of her, waited to be noticed, which took the better part of a quarter hour. The man in charge came over eventually, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket, looked her over the way men in that country looked at a woman standing alone at a gate, which is to say without much interest and with less courtesy. His name, she learned within the first minute, was Rutherford Blake. I was heavy through the shoulders, clean in the beard in a way that suggested a barber's chair somewhere within the last week. He wore a canvas coat that was too new for the season and had never seen a full day of rain. He asked her what her business was at his gate. She told him plainly, I can cook, pack a mule, dress game in the field, find my way back through country most men can't read on their best day. Blake looked at her a long moment. Whose granddaughter are you? Something about the way he asked it, a shade too casual, made a small cold thing turn over once behind her ribs. She told him, Ezekiel Callahan. Blake said the name the way a man says the name of a place he has heard of but not yet been. Then his mouth moved into something that was almost a smile and did not reach his eyes at all. $4 for the trip, he told her. Meals along the way, no more than that. You'll handle the horses at night, cook every camp, and keep your mouth shut around the gentlemen from back east. They are paying good money for a quiet expedition. They do not care to hear a woman's voice at their fire. Wren said yes without bargaining, because $4 was $4, and because the high country in late August was the closest thing to a home she had left in the world. Blake nodded once, told her to be at the gate at first light with her kit ready, turned back to the pack string without another word. She spent the last of her hoarded coins on a small oilcloth she could wrap around the paper sack, a fresh box of matches she buried in the inside pocket of Zeke's coat, and a strip of hard sausage she meant to eat on the trail. She slept the third night in the same stall behind the livery, folding knife in her hand under the blanket, and she woke in the dark before the first light, with the whole weight of the coming week already settled across her shoulders like the coat itself. They rode out of Silver Fork at first light on a Thursday morning. 5 riders, 8 animals, and the wind was already turning in the aspens along the creek by the time they cleared the last fence line north of town. Wren rode at the back of the string on a broad-shouldered bay gelding that was not hers and would not be hers at the end of the week. Her bundle lashed behind the cantle with a strip of latigo. Zeke's coat rolled across her lap in case the weather turned. The 4 gentlemen from back east rode ahead in a tight bunch, speaking to one another in low voices that did not carry back over the sound of the hooves. And Blake rode in the middle between them and her, glancing back over his shoulder every few minutes as though he were counting. They did not speak to her at all through the first day, beyond asking in the evening when the fire was built and the coffee was on, when supper would be ready, whether she had staked the horses well enough to hold them through the night. She staked the horses well. She cooked what she was given to cook. Bacon and beans and biscuits fried in the skillet on a fire she built out of dry lodgepole in a wind that would have defeated most men from town. And she ate her own share sitting a little apart from the fire with her back to the largest of the pines, watching the shape of the country darken around them. She slept a little apart from the men that first night, with the folding knife inside the roll of her blanket and her right hand close to the smooth bone handle in the dark. Zeke had told her once, sitting by his own stove on a winter evening when she was 13, that a person who slept with a blade within reach kept better watch through the night than a person who slept with a rifle across the room. She had not entirely understood him at the time. She understood him now. The trail followed the creek northwest for the first 6 miles of the second day, then broke away into a series of long switchbacks that climbed them up through belts of scrub oak, then Douglas fir, then near the top of the second afternoon into the pale open parks, where the pines thinned out and the grass ran ankle-deep between patches of granite. The 4 gentlemen from back east proved to be the sort of men who had bought their rifles the week before they came west, who could not stay on a horse for 4 hours without complaining about the saddle, who spoke among themselves in a code of names and places she did not recognize and did not try to follow. Blake rode always within earshot of them, always within sight of her. And she began on the second evening to notice how carefully he was not letting any distance grow between the two ends of that string. On the morning of the 4th day, Blake rode back along the string to where she was tightening the diamond hitch on the lead mule, told her in the same too casual voice he had used at the gate in Silver Fork that the gentleman had chosen a drainage from a hand-drawn map one of them had brought from back east, and that she was to ride ahead and scout the head of it before they moved the string down into the basin. He gave her the map. She took it in her right hand, looked at it once, and she saw at first glance that it had been drawn by a man who had never set foot in any country west of the Mississippi. The contours were wrong, the creeks ran the wrong direction off the ridge. The drainage, marked with a small pencil circle at the head of the sheet, was walled on 3 sides by scree so steep that no animal in its right mind would try to cross it, and no bighorn sheep would summer there in any year she had ever heard of. She looked up from the map at Blake's face, and she saw in the careful blankness of it that he already knew everything she had just read. She did not argue. Zeke had taught her in 1,000 small lessons across 8 years that when a man in the wrong wanted an argument, the best thing you could give him was silence in your back. She folded the map, tucked it into the inside pocket of Zeke's coat, swung up onto the bay gelding, and rode out along the shoulder of the long stone ridge to the north without looking behind her. The wind at the top was cold enough that she pulled the coat close at the throat. She rode the shoulder for the better part of 2 hours, following the ridgeline the way Zeke had taught her, keeping the wind on her left cheek so she would not lose her bearing on the ride back. She dropped down into the basin the map had marked, and she saw within the first quarter mile of it that she had read the country correctly at first glance. The grass in the bottom was dead and brown, poisoned by some vein of alkali in the soil. The scattered spruce along the walls were stunted, half of them dead standing. There was no sign of sheep, no sign of deer, no sign of any hoofed animal larger than a mule deer having come down into that basin in the last 10 years. It was a dead pocket in a country full of living ones. No man who had ever hunted west of Chicago would have marked it on a map for anything but a joke. She rode the length of the bottom once to be certain, then turned the bay and started back up the shoulder to report what she had seen. Halfway up, she reined the horse in for a long moment, sat still in the saddle with her hands crossed on the pommel, because a small cold thought had begun to work its way up from the base of her spine, and she wanted to think it through before she rode any farther. Blake had known her grandfather's name. Blake had known that Zeke Callahan was dead. Blake had known or could have learned in a single afternoon in Silver Fork that Zeke's granddaughter had walked into town with a paper sack and no rifle, that no one in that town would come looking for her by the second week of September. He had known when he sent her out along that shoulder with a false map in her hand, exactly what he was doing. She rode the rest of the way up the ridge with the wind picking up steadily off the divide, topped out at the place where she had left the string, and there was nothing there but the shape the animals had pressed into the grass and the black char of the small warming fire she had built at dawn. The tracks led back down the mountain, to the south, not up. She sat the bay gelding at the top of the ridge for a long time without moving. The wind pulled at the collar of Zeke's coat. Her right hand rested on the smooth bone handle of the folding knife inside the roll of her blanket, where she had left it lashed behind the candle. She understood then, in a slow, careful way that did not surprise her nearly as much as she felt it should, that Blake had walked into Silver Fork looking for exactly the sort of person she was. A girl with no family, no rifle, no witness, no one in town who would come looking for her by the second week of September. A girl who could disappear in country like this as easily as a stone dropped into a running creek. He had not come to Silver Fork to hunt bighorn sheep. He had come to find her, or someone very like her, and she had walked into his gate on the third morning and offered herself for $4. The wind came harder off the divide. She felt it press against the small brass compass in the pocket of Zeke's coat, and she thought of the winter she was 12. Standing behind the barn with a lever-action rifle heavier than her arms, and her grandfather saying nothing at all, just resting the flat of his palm against her shoulder blade to steady her sight. She turned the bay gelding east, instead of south, because south was the way Blake's tracks led. And east was the direction of a country she remembered from a summer she had ridden with Zeke when she was 14. She touched her heel to the horse's flank and started down off the ridge into the timber. The last of the afternoon light came slanting through the trunks and long gold bars. And somewhere ahead of her, in a ravine no surveyor had ever set foot in, on a bench 3 acres wide beside a spring that ran cold and clear, out of a crack in the rock, a door stood a quarter open on a drift of pine needles that had lain undisturbed for almost 2 years, waiting for the right person to come. The timber on the east side of the ridge was thicker than the timber on the west. Older growth, never cut, the trunks running dark and straight up into a canopy that filtered the afternoon light down onto the forest floor in shafts the color of weak tea. Wren held the bay gelding to a walk through the first mile of it, letting the animal pick its own line between the deadfall, keeping her weight easy in the saddle. She did not look back over her shoulder toward the ridge, because looking back would tell her nothing she did not already know. Blake was 2 hours south of her by now, or 3, moving fast on rested horses, down a trail he had planned to move down all along. And every minute she spent thinking about him was a minute she was not spending on the country ahead. So she thought about the country ahead. She tried to remember it the way Zeke had shown it to her the summer she was 14. They had ridden out of the cabin on a Monday morning in July, pack mule and a week of supplies, following a game trail that dropped east off the main ridge into a series of drainages Zeke had told her in his flat, unhurried voice were as fine a piece of hunting country as any man was likely to see in one lifetime. She had been young enough that summer to still be surprised by things. She remembered the drainages the way a child remembers a room she has been in once, in patches, impressions, the shape of a particular boulder above a spring, the smell of the pines after a rainstorm, the sound of an elk bugling at dusk from a park she could not see from where they had made their camp. She remembered the spring. She remembered that Zeke had knelt beside it, cupped water into his hand, told her that a spring like that, running clear and cold out of a crack in the rock in the middle of a summer that had otherwise dried the country to bone, was worth more than a section of good pasture on a river bottom. She could not remember now, riding with the bay gelding, stepping careful over a fallen fir, exactly which drainage the spring had been in. She could remember only that it had been east of the main ridge, and lower than she was now, and that the game trail Zeke had followed had cut across the shoulder of a stone outcropping shaped like the prow of a boat. The bay gelding threw a shoe on a stretch of loose shale in the late afternoon of that first day. The animal came up lame within the hour. She dismounted at the edge of a small park where the grass ran waist-high and the last of the day sun was slanting in gold across the tops of the spruce. Stripped the saddle and the blanket and the bridle from the horse with hands that had done it 1,000 times before and did not need her attention now. Checked the hoof, ran her thumb along the frog, felt the heat coming off the coronet. Stone bruise. Nothing worse. But he would not carry her another mile that afternoon. She led him to the edge of the park where a shallow creek ran through the grass, slipped the halter off his head, turned him toward the water. The country was full of feed and full of drink. There were wild bands running these drainages every summer. He would find his way to one of them, or he would not. Either way, she had done what she could. She shouldered the saddle blanket, rolled up her bundle, tucked Zeke's coat close at the throat, and started east on foot, with the folding knife on her right hip and the small brass compass in her palm. She walked through the last hour of daylight, then through the long blue dusk that ran under the trees for another hour after that. then into a full dark that pressed close on both sides of her. She slept a few hours in the lee of a fallen fir, wool blanket wrapped tight, back against the log, woke stiff and cold in a gray dawn, chewed a strip of the hard sausage she had bought in Silver Fork, drank from a rivulet she found by following her ears, and walked on. By the middle of the second morning, the country began in small ways to feel familiar. There was a shape to a ridgeline off to her left that put a hitch in her breathing. There was a stand of aspens on a south-facing slope that had turned a particular yellow-green in the July of her 14th summer, and turned the same yellow-green now. There was when she topped a small rise and looked ahead down a long draw the prow of a boat cut into gray stone above a black notch of timber. She stopped walking for the first time since dawn, stood very still on the game trail, the wind moving quiet through the pines around her. She was not exactly where Zeke had brought her, but she was close. The game trail dropped off the shoulder of the outcropping into a ravine that was narrower than it looked from above, its walls climbing steep on both sides, its floor thick with old-growth spruce and a scatter of house-sized boulders that had fallen from the rim in some spring runoff long before her grandfather had been born. She followed the trail down through the timber for perhaps a quarter mile, moving slow, because the pitch was steep, and the folding knife's sheath was rubbing raw against her hip through the wool of her trousers. The trail leveled out. The trees opened. She came around the shoulder of the last boulder in the string, and stopped. The bench was perhaps 3 acres, flat as a plate, running along the floor of the ravine between the creek that came out of the rock at the north end and the timber that closed in again at the south. The grass on it had been cut once in some long-ago summer and was now knee-high and going to seed. Ryegrass and timothy and a thin scatter of yellow-flowered weeds she did not know the name of. At the north end of the bench, set back perhaps 20 paces from the spring, on a rise just high enough to shed water in the wettest year, stood a cabin. It was not large. She measured it with her eye at 14 feet by 18. Walls of squared lodgepole, chinked with clay and horsehair, roof of split cedar shakes gone the pale silver of driftwood under 20 seasons of sun and snow. The door of 2 thick planks pinned with wooden pegs, hung on strap hinges forged by hand at a small forge somewhere. It stood a quarter open on a drift of pine needles that had blown in through the winter and lay undisturbed on the puncheons inside. Above the door, cut into the top log with a chisel by a hand that had known what it was doing, was a small 5-pointed star. The cut was old, darkened almost to black at the edges, the wood around it weathered smooth. Wren stood at the edge of the bench for a long moment before she moved. She had not seen this cabin in her 14th summer. Zeke had not brought her here. Though they had camped somewhere within a few miles of it, whoever had built it to be found by accident, or not at all, and had chosen the ground the way a man chooses ground he means to hold against every kind of weather. She crossed the grass slow, watching the door, watching the woods along the walls of the ravine, watching for a chimney of smoke that was not there. Nothing moved on the bench but the top of the grass in a small idle wind. She stepped up onto the flat stone that served as a threshold, put her hand flat against the plank of the door. The door swung on its hinges without a sound, which meant that whoever had built it had greased the pins with tallow at least once every fall for as long as he had lived here. The air inside came out cool and dry against her face, smelled of dust and cured pine, and the faint sweetness of old wood smoke worked deep into the logs. She stood in the doorway a full minute, letting her eyes adjust. And when they did, she saw the shape of the room the builder had made for himself and the shape of the 2-year absence that had settled over it since. Stone hearth in the north wall, river cobbles set in lime mortar, the throat above it dark with the soot of 1,000 fires. Beside the hearth stood a cast-iron stove of a make she did not know, squat and heavy, the pipe running up through a collar in the roof, the damper stiff on its shaft but whole. Plank table against the west wall under the one window. Single stool tucked beneath it, a rope-strung bed frame along the east wall without any tick on it, a set of shelves nailed to the west wall above the table, and on the shelves set as neat as a shopkeeper had set them the day before. 3 tin plates, 2 tin cups, a whetstone worn hollow in the middle, a tin of matches gone rust-red at the seams, a coil of hemp rope thick as her wrist, and a leather-bound ledger with a bootlace tied around it to keep the cover shut. The floor was of wide split puncheons, worn smooth in a track that ran from the door to the hearth, by the feet of a man who had crossed it thousands of times over some long span of years, and then at some point she could not yet name had stopped crossing it at all. She stood inside the door a long moment more, and she said aloud to no one in the quiet of a room that had heard no human voice in a long time, "Whoever you were, I mean you no harm." She set the saddle blanket bundle on the plank table, walked the room once slow, laying her hand flat on the top of the stove, on the mantel above the hearth, on the taut rope of the bed frame, on the spine of the ledger. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing had been moved from the last hand that had moved it. The dust on the mantel was even, undisturbed by any recent tread of animal or man, thick enough that her fingertip left a clean line when she drew it across. She did not open the ledger yet. She was hungry. Her feet were cold. There was work to do first. And Zeke had taught her that a person who sat down in a strange place to read a book before she had fetched water and built a fire was a person who did not deserve either. She took one of the tin cups from the shelf, wiped it out with the tail of her shirt, walked out to the spring, dipped the cup, drank it standing. The water was so cold it hurt her teeth. She drank 2 more cups, felt the ache of the walk begin to ease behind her ribs, and started gathering wood. She built a small fire in the stove with dry lodgepole twigs and a handful of pine cones, coaxed it up on the 3rd match from the rusted tin, sat on the puncheons in front of the open door of the firebox with her hands held out to the heat. The stove drew clean once the pipe warmed. The light of the fire moved on the logs of the wall behind her, and the room began slowly to feel like a room a person could stay in for a night. She warmed through until her fingers stopped aching. Ate the last of the sausage and half of a heel of bread she had been carrying since the 2nd night on the trail. Sat there a long time, thinking about nothing at all, because there was nothing at that particular moment that thinking would improve. When her hands could work small buttons again, she rose from the floor and went to the shelf and took down the ledger. Untied the bootlace, laid it flat on the table beside the book, opened the covers under the last of the daylight coming through the window. The paper was heavier than she was used to, thick, slightly yellowed at the edges. The ink was brown and had faded at the tops of the strokes to something close to sepia. The hand was upright, careful. The letters formed one at a time by a man who had been taught to write in a schoolroom somewhere long before she was born. The first page carried a single paragraph. She read it, standing at the table with her fingertip under each line. "This cabin was built by me, Ambrose Thorne, in the spring of 1866 on ground I found by accident in the fall of the year before, and kept for myself, being at that time 39 years of age, lately mustered out of the Union Army, where I served as quartermaster's clerk under Colonel Ashworth in the mountain operations of 1863 and 1864, of which more will follow in later pages if the Lord grants me the time to set it down." The name meant nothing to her, and yet the name meant everything, because it was the first proof that the room she was standing in had once been a home to a specific man, and not simply an accident of the country. She turned the page. The entries that followed were dated by month and year in the same careful upright hand, and she read them one at a time, standing over the book, her hip against the edge of the table, the fire ticking soft in the stove behind her. Ambrose Thorne had lived in this cabin 19 winters. He had trapped marten and mink along the small creek that ran the length of the ravine below the spring, sold the pelts twice a year at a post she did not recognize the name of, taken 2 elk a summer for his own meat, cut his own firewood with a buck saw whose handle he had turned himself on a lathe made of a wagon wheel and a leather strap. He had written of weather. He had written in a long entry dated December of 1874 of a dog named Pilot, who had come to the cabin door as a stray puppy in the fall of the year Ambrose had built the place, who had run every trap line with him for 11 winters, who had died in his sleep by the stove on a January night when the wind had scoured the ravine bare of snow. He had written of a woman he had loved before the war, a woman named Cordelia, whom he had not married and had never seen again after the summer of 1862, and of whom he had written only once in the whole of the ledger, in a single paragraph so plain and so restrained that Wren felt her throat tighten reading it by the light of the window. He had written in a long entry dated the 2nd week of November of 1884 that his heart had begun to trouble him through the winter just past, that he did not expect to see many more springs, and that he was therefore setting down in the back of this book certain matters he had carried alone for 20 years and had never spoken of to any living person. He wished, he wrote, if any decent person should find this book after he was gone, that those matters be at last set down where they might do some good in the world. He did not think, he wrote, that he had many more months in which to write them. Wren closed the ledger with her thumb inside to mark the place, walked to the stove, put another few sticks of lodgepole into the firebox, adjusted the damper. She stood there a moment with her hand on the warm iron of the stovetop, and she thought of the words her grandfather had said on her 17th birthday. About the knife, about a friend, and she said aloud, quiet into the room that had been quiet for a very long time, "You did not know I was coming. But I am here." She turned the ledger to the back. The last written page was dated the second week of December of 1884. The entry was short. It read that the writer was tired that morning, that the pain in his chest had returned in the night, that he had built the fire before dawn but had not been able to bring himself to walk down to the creek for water, and that he was going to lie down for a little while and try to sleep. The hand that had written that entry was steady. It did not tremble on the page. It stopped at the end of the last sentence in a small, clean period, and it did not resume. The pages after it were blank. Behind the last blank page sewn into the binding with a length of waxed linen thread, the color of old butters, was a folded square of oil paper. She took the folding knife from its sheath at her hip, opened it against the ball of her thumb the way Zeke had shown her, and cut the threads one at a time, careful not to tear the paper of the binding. She lifted the packet out onto the table, unfolded it under the light of the window. 3 things inside. The first was a hand-drawn map of the ravine and the bench and the ground above them, marked in Ambrose Thorne's careful upright hand, with a small inked cross at the base of the hearth. The second was a sealed letter, folded 3 times, addressed on the outside in the same hand, "To whoever finds this, being a person in need." The third was a smaller sheet folded once, written in a different blockier hand in an older, darker ink. Its heading read, "Personal Accounting, Ambrose Thorne, Trapper, Silver Fork Region, Springs 1867 through 1884. She read the third sheet first, because it was the shortest, and she wanted to know what she was looking at before she opened the letter. It was a careful column of figures, kept in a bookkeeper's hand, listing by year and season the number of pelts Ambrose Thorne had sold, the price he had received per pelt, the total in gold and silver he had brought home from each trip to the post, and the running balance he had cashed each winter under the hearth of the cabin. She read down the column slowly, read down it a second time, sat down on the stool at the table, because her legs had without warning gone unreliable underneath her. The running balance at the last line, dated 1884, ran to a figure larger than any single sum of money she had ever seen written down in one place in her life. It was not a fortune the way the men in the eastern cities counted fortunes. It was the fortune of one careful man who had lived alone in a 2-room cabin for 19 winters, spent almost nothing on himself, sold his pelts every spring and every fall, and put away every coin he had not needed for salt and matches and coffee and lead shot. It was a working life reduced to a column of neat brown ink, and at the bottom of the column in a slightly darker ink was a small note, "For the person who comes next." She set the accounting sheet down, picked up the sealed letter, turned it over in her hands twice, the way a person turns a thing she has waited a long time to open. Then she broke the seal with the point of the folding knife, unfolded the paper on the table. "I am Ambrose Thorne," the letter began, "formerly quartermaster's clerk of the Ashworth detachment, lately a trapper and solitary man of this ravine for 19 winters. If you are reading these lines, then I am past reading them myself, and the ground I have kept is now yours to keep in your turn. I want to set down for you in a plain hand 3 things. The first is that everything cached beneath the hearth of this cabin is my own money, earned by my own work, from the sale of pelts I took by my own trap line along the creek below this bench. There is no army money among it. There is no man's coin among it but mine. I have kept careful accounts, which you will find on a sheet folded with this letter. Any bookkeeper in the territory can verify what I have written against the sales records of the trading post at Camp Rawlins, where I did my business every spring and fall for 19 years. I say this because I do not wish the person who finds this cabin to carry any doubt in her heart about what she is inheriting. It is honest money, kept by an honest man, and it is now honestly yours." Wren read that paragraph twice, let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Read on. "The second thing I wish to set down is that I have been alone in this ravine for a very long time, and that I have thought in the last 2 winters about the shape of a life spent almost entirely without company. I do not regret the choice I made in 1866, but I have come to see late in the season of my life that a man who keeps only his own counsel eventually finds that he has kept it too well. I have wished this past year that I had gone down out of these mountains just once, in some year when I still had the strength, to find the persons who once mattered to me and to tell them what I had never told them plainly. I did not. I let each year go by and told myself the next year would serve. Do not, if you can help it, make that same mistake. She set the letter down flat on the table for a moment, rested her palm on it. She was not, she realized with some small surprise, thinking of Ambrose Thorne at all in that moment. She was thinking of Zeke, of the winter she was 17, of the way she had never once in all the years afterward sat down and told him plainly what the knife had meant to her. He had known. She was almost certain he had known, but she had never said it aloud, and now she would not say it. And the letter in her hand had named the thing she had been carrying under her ribs since May without giving it a name of her own. She picked up the letter again. There was more. The third thing I must set down is a matter I have carried since the winter of 1863, and have never until this hour written down or spoken of to any living soul. In the December of that year, in the night of the second river crossing, during the movement of Colonel Ashworth's column through the high country, a scout came into our camp after full dark, half frozen, having lost his horse on the far bank in a stretch of broken ice. I was a lean, weathered man in those days, past his first youth, but still moving as easy as a younger man in the saddle, and he carried the manner of a person who had been living outdoors for a great many months and was no longer surprised by the country doing what the country will do. He warmed himself at our fire for perhaps 2 hours, drank coffee out of my tin cup, gave me his name, which I have kept written in the front of my Bible ever since. His name was Ezekiel Callahan. Wren read the name once and did not read on. She sat still at the plank table with the letter open flat in front of her, watched the last of the daylight move across the puncheons of the floor, and felt in a way she could not have described to another person if her life had depended on it. The whole shape of the room reorganized itself around her. She had walked into this cabin 2 hours ago as a stranger. She was not a stranger anymore. She was the granddaughter of a man who had drunk coffee out of a tin cup in this room, or in a tent that had preceded this room. 23 years before she was born, and a memory came up in her then, uninvited, sharp. The winter she was 16, the kitchen, Zeke at the table with his coffee. There is a man somewhere I have never been able to find. He held something of mine for me. In the war, I told him I would come back for it. I looked. 20 years. I could not find him. The stove ticked into the corner. The daylight moved another inch across the floor, and a sound came up out of Wren's chest that she had not heard from herself in the 2 months since Zeke had died. A single small sound, not a sob, not quite. Something older than that and quieter. She sat with it a long moment, and then she said aloud to the room and to no one, and to her grandfather, "You were not making it up. You really were looking for him." She let the tears come then. For the first time in 11 years. Not for herself. For a man she had watched sit at a kitchen table for 8 winters, turning a tin cup slow in his hands, carrying a thing he could not put down, and never once saying its name out loud to the one person who would have understood him. She wiped her face on the sleeve of Zeke's coat and read on. Her hand, when she picked the letter up again, was steadier than she had expected it to be. He carried with him, the letter continued, a small brass compass, which he had used, he told me, to keep his bearing on his rides into the ranges north of the column's line of march. He would not sleep by our fire that night, though we asked him plainly to stay. He said he had to ride out again before first light, since a report was owed to Colonel Ashworth by the following noon, and he did not trust the second river crossing to hold together for another day of thawing weather. He asked me, before he left, to keep his compass for him against his return, since he did not wish to lose it in a second cold water, and he had come to trust me on the strength of 2 hours of conversation, which I have thought about many times in the years since, and which I have come to believe was a piece of judgment on his part that most men do not carry. He rode out an hour before first light. He did not come back. I asked after him at every camp of the column for the rest of that winter, and again at every post I passed through in the spring of 1864, and I could not find him or word of him, and by the end of that summer the mountain campaigns had ended, and the column had scattered, and I had come to believe that Ezekiel Callahan had passed through some cold country I could not follow him into. I did not, however, throw the compass away. I did not later sell it or trade it or lose it. I carried it out of the war, and I carried it into these mountains in the spring of 1866, and I have kept it in a fold of blue wool in a tin box under the hearth of this cabin for 19 winters. And every spring when I opened the box to count the coin, I looked at the compass and told myself that this year I would ride down to Silver Fork and ask after the man's family. I did not go. I told myself the next year would serve. I do not know if you, whoever you are any relation to the man Ezekiel Callahan. It is very likely you are not, since the country is wide and the years are many. But if you are, then the compass is yours, and it comes to you with my apology for not having found you sooner. And if you are not, then take it to whatever end you can find for it. And know that it was carried across 2 rivers in 1 war, and 20 years of ordinary weather by 2 men who each meant to give it back. Wren folded the letter along its careful creases, set it down beside the accounting sheet and the hand-drawn map. Did not for a moment move at all. She sat at the plank table in the deepening blue of a summer evening, in a cabin that had not been entered by any living person in almost 2 years. And she thought about Zeke riding out of a camp somewhere north of a river she had never seen. On a horse she had never known the name of, with a compass in his coat pocket he had left in trust with a stranger. She thought about the way he had never spoken of the mountain campaigns in her hearing. Not once. Not on any of the long winter evenings when she had been small enough to ask him what he had done in the war. Not on the porch of the cabin above Silver Fork on any of the summer nights when he had sat with his coffee and watched the sun go down behind the ridge. She had known in some general way that he had been a scout. She had not known that a stranger in an army camp had once trusted him on the strength of 2 hours of talk, and had kept that trust for 2 decades in a tin box under a stone hearth. She rose from the stool, her knees were stiff, walked to the hearth and knelt down on the puncheons in front of it. The river cobbles at the base of the throat were set in a course of lime mortar, the same as the rest, but the mortar in one section no bigger across than a dinner plate was slightly paler in color, slightly finer in grain, as though it had been mixed by the same hand at a later date, and worked into the joints one careful trowel at a time. She could see the seam now that she was looking for it. She had not seen it when she walked in. Took the folding knife from its sheath, worked the point of the blade into the seam at the top of the paler section, chipped the mortar out of the joints one at a time, patient as a woman shelling peas at a kitchen table, the small dry crumbs of it falling onto the puncheons around her knees. It took her perhaps a quarter of an hour to loosen the whole section. She set the folding knife aside on the hearth, fitted her fingers into the top seam of the paler stones, and lifted the first cobble free. 4 cobbles set into the plate-sized section, each perhaps the size of a man's fist. She lifted them out one at a time, set them in a neat row on the puncheons beside her. Beneath them, set flush with the floor of the firebox, was a plank lid perhaps 1.5 feet square, its top surface stained and darkened by 20 years of ash. She lifted the lid free. Beneath the lid was a shallow box lined on its sides and bottom with sheet tin hammered flat and lapped at the seams. Inside the box, laid neat as a shopkeeper's stock, were the things Ambrose Thorne had cached there over 19 winters. A canvas sack, heavy in her hands when she lifted it, stitched shut across its mouth with wax thread. She cut the stitches with the folding knife. A run of gold coins spilled onto the plank floor with the small dry sound of hard metal on wood. Double eagles by the shape and weight of them, more than she could count on a first glance. She stopped trying to count them, set the sack upright, and let the coin settle, a second smaller sack of silver dollars, its mouth tied with a length of the same wax thread, an oilcloth-wrapped bundle of paper currency, banded and dry, the band stamped with the name of a bank in Cheyenne she did not recognize. A small ledger folded in the same oilcloth. When she opened it, she saw it was a duplicate of the accounting sheet she had already read, kept in the same careful hand, updated to the last entry of the summer of 1884. Underneath all of it, wrapped in a square of blue wool that had once been the sleeve of a uniform coat, lay a small brass compass. She lifted it out with both hands. The wool fell open in her palm. The case was dented on one side, worn smooth on the other, the glass over the face scratched in a long, thin line that ran from the north point to the south. She turned the compass over in her hand, and on the back of the case, engraved in a small, even script, were the letters ZC, and below them in a slightly smaller line the date 1863. She sat back on her heels on the puncheons in front of the hearth, held the compass in her right hand. The folding knife lay on the stone beside her left, and she looked at the 2 objects in the last of the light coming through the window, and she reached into the pocket of Zeke's coat, drew out the second compass, the one Mortimer Craddock had written into the receipt on a Tuesday afternoon in July, the one Zeke had kept in the drawer under the window for as long as she had known him. She set it down on the hearth beside the first. 2 brass compasses, same maker, same size, same weathered case. The one from the box was older, more scarred, in the scratch across its glass a longer story than the second compass had ever lived. She turned them both over. Both cases carried the same engraving. Zeke, 1863. Zeke had had two. He had lost one in a river he did not name. Been given a second, she guessed, by the Army quartermaster before he rode out the next spring. Carried the second one home from the war and into the mountains and into his kitchen drawer. And the first one had waited 19 winters in a tin box under a stone hearth for his granddaughter to lay it down beside its twin. She said aloud, quiet, in a voice that was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Grandfather, you did come back for it. You just took the long way around." The needle inside the older compass, when she held it flat in her palm, settled slowly to the north, toward the door of the cabin, toward the mouth of the ravine, toward the direction she had walked in from that afternoon. She did not put the older compass back into the box. She wrapped it in the blue wool, slid it into the pocket of Zeke's coat, where the second compass already lay. The two of them together at last, where her hand could find them both without looking. She gathered the loose double eagles back into the canvas sack, set the sack and the smaller sack of silver collars and the oilcloth bundle of paper currency back into the tin-lined box the way Ambrose Thorne had laid them, fitted the plank lid back over them, replaced the 4 cobbles one at a time, tapping each one home with the flat of her palm. She did not remortar the seams that night, because she was tired and the mortar could wait for morning. Built the stove fire back up to a steady burn, fetched a fresh cup of water from the spring, untied the wool blanket from around her bundle, spread it on the rope-strung bed frame, laid the saddle blanket underneath it for a tick, sat down on the edge of the bed and unlaced her boots, pulled the $11 out of the lining of her right boot, looked at it in the light of the stove, thought about the sum of what she had walked into this ravine carrying, and the sum of what she was walking out with when the sun came up. And she did not know whether to laugh or to weep, and in the end she did neither, because Zeke had never done either in her hearing, and she did not know how to start on his account now. She lay down on the bed with the folding knife inside the roll of the blanket next to her right hand. The stove ticked in the corner. The wind moved through the pines outside the window, and just before sleep took her, she heard a sound outside the cabin door. Small, uncertain. The soft padding step of an animal on the flat threshold stone. She lay very still. Her hand found the folding knife. The step came again, slower this time. And then a low sound, not a growl, something older, something more tired, a whine. She rose from the bed, barefoot on the puncheons, went to the door and pulled it open a hand's width. Standing on the threshold stone, in the last blue light of the summer evening, is a dung, old gray around the muzzle, ribs showing under a coat that had once been thick and was now thin as a worn shirt. His eyes were the pale milk blue of an animal who has stopped seeing sharp and has learned to trust his nose and his ears and the shape of the ground under his feet. He looked at her a long moment, did not move, did not turn away. Around his neck was a strip of old harness leather worn soft with weather, and burned into the leather with a hot wire in a hand she recognized from the ledger inside was a single word: pilot. Wren knelt down slow on the threshold stone, held out her hand. The dog stepped forward once, touched his cold nose to the back of her fingers, and sat down. She did not know how he had lived, whether Ambrose Thorne had left him at some cabin down valley the last time he rode out, whether a rancher had taken him in for 2 winters and then let him go, whether he had run wild in this country the whole time and only come back to the ravine now that the wind carried the smell of wood smoke out of the chimney for the first time in almost 2 years. She did not know. She would never know. She only knew that he had come to her door, and that he was too old to sleep outside. She stood aside. The dog stepped past her into the room, walked slow to the warm iron of the stove, and lay down on the puncheons beside it with a small dry sound that might have been a sigh. Sigh. Wren closed the door behind him, went back to the bed, lay down again with the folding knife and the roll of the blanket next to her right hand. The stove ticked. The dog's breathing settled into the slow rhythm of an old animal who has come inside from a long cold. And Wren thought in the last minute before sleep took her of Rutherford Blake riding south through the timber with her $4 in his pocket. And she thought without any particular anger that he did not know yet what he had walked away from. He had left her, he believed, to disappear like a stone dropped into a running creek. Hone had left her instead to a plank table and a stone hearth in a tin box under the floor, and to 2 brass compasses her grandfather had carried in a war he never once spoke of, and to an old gray dog with a milky eye and a name burned into his collar by a man who had been dead almost 2 years, and to the plain, quiet fact that the ground she was lying above had been waiting patient as weather for exactly this hour. She woke in a gray dawn to the sound of the creek running out of the rock at the north end of the bench. The stove was cold. Her breath made a small, thin cloud in the air above her face. The old dog pilot lay on the puncheons beside the stove, exactly where he had lain down the night before, his ribs rising and falling slow, his pale, milky eye half open. Watching her without seeming to watch her at all, she lay still a long moment, made a list in her head of what she would do first and second and third. Because Zeke had taught her that a person who woke in a new place with a list already made was a person who did not waste the first hour of the morning standing in the middle of a room wondering what to do. She rose from the bed, rebuilt the fire in the stove, went out to the spring and washed her face in water so cold it made her forehead ache. The dog followed her to the door, stood on the threshold stone, did not step outside, came back in, sat down on the stool at the plank table, and began, in the patient order her grandfather had taught her to make the cabin fit to live in. She swept the puncheon floor with a broom she made in the first hour of the morning, binding a bundle of spruce twigs to a peeled pine stick with a length of the hemp rope from the shelf. Scraped the old ash out of the firebox, carried it in a tin plate to the edge of the timber, scattered it across the roots of a young pine, the way Zeke had scattered ash at his own cabin above Silver Fork. Said doing it that it was one small kindness to the tree in exchange for the wood she was going to be burning through the winter. She brushed the inside of the pipe from below. With a length of wire she straightened from a nail, she pried out of the shelf, working the wire up in short, careful strokes until the flakes of creosote fell down into the firebox and could be swept out. Reset the damper on its shaft with a drop of tallow she cut from the last of the hard sausage. Worked the shaft back and forth until it swung true. Walked the walls from inside and outside. Found 2 gaps in the north wall where the clay chinking had cracked and fallen out. Mixed fresh clay from the bank of the spring with a handful of horsehair she pulled from the underside of the abandoned saddle. Pressed the new chinking into the gaps with her thumbs. Smoothed it flat with the back of a tin plate. Rehung the door true on its strap hinges by cutting a small shim from a cedar shake with the folding knife, driving it under the lower pin with the heel of her palm, and when she swung the door afterward, it moved without sag. Closed against its jamb with the small, clean sound of a well-fitted board. Restrung the bed frame with a fresh length of the hemp rope, tying the rope through the pegs at each corner and weaving it back and forth across the frame in the diamond pattern Zeke had shown her on a winter evening when she was 12. Cut a bundle of dry meadowgrass at the edge of the timber with the folding knife. Spread it on the roof shakes to dry through the middle of the day, and later when the grass was crisp and pale, she stuffed it into a tick she sewed together in 2 hours from the emptied paper sack her mother's Bible had once traveled in. The old dog pilot watched her from beside the stove, ate what she gave him, a handful of dried meat softened in warm water, drank from a tin plate she set beside the door, slept most of the day. She thought watching him breathe on the 4th afternoon that he had come to the door of this cabin to finish something, and she thought that whatever it was, he could take his time. On the 6th morning after she had first stepped up onto the threshold stone of the cabin, she rose in the dark before dawn, dressed, laced her boots, took 4 of the double eagles from the tin-lined box under the hearth, slipped them into a small pouch she had sewn from the tail of her spare shirt, put the pouch inside her right boot beside what remained of the $11, took the leather-bound ledger from the shelf, took the 2 brass compasses from the pocket of Zeke's coat, laid them side by side on the plank table one last moment before she slid them back into the pocket, stepped out onto the threshold stone, pulled the door of the cabin closed behind her, stood a moment on the flat stone with her hand on the plank of the door, looked once at the small 5-pointed star cut it into the top log above the lintel, turned her face down the ravine, toward the game trail, toward the country between herself and Silver Fork. The wind moved cold along the bench, and the old dog pilot rose from the threshold stone behind her, walked slow but steady to her heel, and did not stop. She looked down at him a long moment, did not tell him to stay. He would not have stayed. She started walking. The walk down out of the ravine took her the better part of 2 days. Moving on foot the way she had come, cutting east across the shoulder of a lower ridge to pick up the trail she had ridden with Zeke when she was 14. She slept the first night in the lee of a stand of aspens, where the wind came up hard after midnight and rattled the leaves overhead like coins in a tin plate. The old dog lay curled tight against the small of her back through the whole of the night. He did not complain. He did not slow her. He walked at her heel through the second morning at a pace she matched to his, and when he stopped once at the edge of a small park to sit down and pant, she sat down beside him. waited without a word, and went on when he rose. She came in sight of Silver Fork by the middle of Thursday afternoon, walking down out of the last belt of scrub oak into the flat brown country north of the freight yard. She had planned the order of the visits in her head over the 2 days on the trail. The way Zeke once planned a hunting week in reverse, from the last load to the first. First the marshal, because a woman walking into town on foot with a story to tell needed to tell it while the story was still fresh. Then the land office, because the ravine was ground unentered on any patent book she knew of, and she meant to make it hers on paper before the paper closed against her. Then the mercantile, because a person who meant to spend a winter in a cabin needed flour before she needed anything else. The marshal's office in Silver Fork stood at the north end of the main street, a low-frame building of unpainted pine with a single window on the street side and a hand-lettered sign over the door that read simply Marshal. She stepped up onto the boardwalk with her bundle at her back. The old dog pilot lay down on the boards beside the door, as though he had done it 1,000 times before. She pushed the door open without knocking. The man behind the desk looked up from a green ledger he had been writing in with a steel pen, looked at her a long moment before he set the pen down in its rest, rose from his chair. His name was Aldous Reed. I had been marshal in Silver Fork for the better part of 16 years, a widower 9 years running, a lean tall man of 51, with iron in his hair at the temples, and the flat unreadable eyes of a man whose face had learned early not to reveal what his mind was doing. He gestured her toward the chair on the far side of the desk without a word, sat back down, opened the green ledger to a fresh page. She sat, set the bundle at her feet, began in the plainest voice she could manage to tell him what had happened. She gave him the whole of it, from the yard behind the assay office to the shale bench at the top of the false drainage. In the same flat unadorned order Zeke would have used to give a sheriff the account of a stolen mule. She did not use the word abandoned. She said instead that when she had ridden back up the shoulder of the ridge at mid-afternoon on the 4th day out of town, the pack string had already been gone from the place she had left it, and that the tracks in the soft ground had led back down the mountain and not up. Aldous Reed wrote it down as she spoke, the pen moving steady across the page. When she finished, he asked her twice to repeat the name Rutherford Blake, and once to spell it. Then he set the pen down, looked at her across the desk, a long moment before he spoke. I have been watching those 4 gentlemen for the last week. His voice was low and dry, without any particular color to it. They were not hunting bighorn. She said nothing. They were hunting a girl. She waited. You are the 4th this summer that I know of. The room went quiet. The other 3 are still missing. He closed the green ledger with the flat of his palm. I will ride out for him at first light tomorrow. You have my word he will not enjoy the ride back. She said nothing to that because there was nothing useful to say. And Zeke had taught her that a person who filled a silence a lawman had left open was usually a person who ended up saying too much. She thanked Aldous Reed in a level voice, picked up her bundle, walked out onto the boardwalk into the flat white afternoon light, stood there a moment with her hand on the porch post. The old dog pilot rose from the boards, pressed his gray muzzle against her knee. She had known standing at the top of the ridge 4 days ago that Blake had chosen her on purpose. She had not known until that moment in the marshal's office that she had been the 4th name on a list. The knowledge did not frighten her exactly. It settled into her the way cold water settles into a dry well, filling a space she had not known was there. The land office stood a quarter of the way down the street on the west side, a narrow storefront with a green shade pulled halfway across the window. Small hand-painted sign that read United States Land Office, Silver Fork District. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man of 34 in a green eye shade, wire-rimmed spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, ink stains on the second knuckle of his right hand. His name was Levi Ostrand. He had held the post in Silver Fork for 11 years, and he was by the general agreement of the town, the only man in the county who read a plat map faster than he read the newspaper. He glanced up when she came in, saw the bundle at her back and the dust on her boots, gestured her to the counter with the same neutral courtesy he gave to a cattleman filing on a section of river bottom. She unfolded the hand-drawn map from the leather ledger, laid it flat on the counter between them. Did not tell him where the map had come from. Told him only that she wished to file a homestead claim on the bench in the ravine floor drawn on the sheet. Gave him from memory the compass bearings in rough distances. She had walked the day before she left the cabin, asked him to check the parcel against his patent book. Levi Ostrand looked at the map a long moment without touching it, turned to a shelf of leather-bound volumes behind him, pulled down 2, opened them on the counter, ran his finger across a plat sheet, then across a second, then across a third. Nothing, he said at half to himself. This ground has not been entered. It has not been surveyed on any sheet I hold. It sits in a corner of the district that never got walked, because the country around it is not worth walking for anything but Martin. He looked up at her over the wire rims of his spectacles. You mean to prove up on it? I mean to live on it. She said it plain. The proving up will follow. He nodded once, as though the answer satisfied him, walked her through the filing form line by line, wrote out the description in his own careful hand, took her signature and her fee of $1.75 in coin from the pouch inside her boot, gave her a receipt stamped and dated Thursday, August the 19th, 1886. Told her that under the law she had 6 months to establish residence on the parcel and 5 years to prove up on it for patent, and that if she wished a copy of the plat drawn to scale, she could have it at cost within the fortnight. She thanked him, folded the receipt into the leather ledger, walked back out onto the street. The mercantile of Wendell Pike stood on the east side of the street opposite the assay office. Wendell Pike was 46 that summer, a wide-shouldered man with sandy hair, going gray at the sideburns, in a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles pushed up on his forehead most of the day. He had run the store for 11 years and kept a fair scale. He was the cousin of Mrs. Beaumont, who had shut her door on Wren at the north end of the street on her first morning in town. Though he did not resemble Mrs. Beaumont in any respect that mattered. I was standing behind the long plank counter counting out 6-penny nails into a paper twist when Wren walked in with her bundle over her shoulder, the old dog Pilot at her heel. He looked up, set the nails down, watched her cross the floor without a word. She set one of the double eagles on the counter between them. Did not offer any explanation for it, said only, I need to fit out a cabin for a winter. I have a list. I would rather not go to any other store. Wendell Pike looked at the gold coin, looked at her face, did not reach for the coin, said, I do not need to know where that came from. She waited. I do need to know that you can answer me one plain question. She waited. Is the money yours by right? She met his eyes. It is mine by the will of a man who left it to whoever came next. I have the letter he wrote. I have the accounts he kept. Marshall Reed can vouch for the manner of my finding it if he is asked. Wendell Pike nodded once, picked up the double eagle, weighed it in his palm, set it on the small brass scale at the end of the counter, watched the balance settle, gave her the exchange in working coin without any further conversation, laid it out in a neat row of silver dollars and half-dollars along the counter, took a pencil from behind his ear, turned to a fresh page in the store ledger. Read me your list. She read it. Flour, 100 pounds in a good sack that would keep. Salt, 10 pounds. Coffee, 5 pounds roasted and ground. Lard, a small keg, 6 boxes of lucifer matches dry. A second wool blanket heavier than the one she carried. A small axe with a straight handle, of the size a woman could swing all day without tearing her shoulder. A whetstone finer than the one on the shelf of the cabin, since Ambrose Thorne's had been worn to a hollow. A tin of black tea, since Zeke had liked it in the evenings, and she had come to like it too. A tin of baking powder, a tin of dried apples, a pound of hard soap, a used single-shot rifle in a caliber she could load for herself, with a box of cartridges and a cleaning rod. She saw Wendell Pike's pencil pause a moment on the last line. He did not look up. He wrote it down, said, I have a Sharp's carbine in the back that a fellow left on account 2 years ago and never came back for. It is not a pretty gun. It shoots true at 200 yards. I will let you have it for $12 in the box of cartridges, and I will throw in the cleaning rod, because I do not like to see a gun leave my counter without one, she said. That will do. He set the pencil down, wiped his hand on the front of his apron, said, without any change in his voice, Your grandfather brought me a pair of elk quarters in November of the year I opened the store. She stood very still. I had not laid in enough meat for the winter, and my wife was 6 months along with our first. He looked past her at the window. He would not take money for them. He said Silver Fork looked after its own, or it did not, and he meant to find out which. He looked back at her then, his eyes level, no sentiment in them, only the plain, flat statement of an old accounting. I have thought about that afternoon on and off for 11 years. She could not speak. The 6-penny nails you did not ask for are on the house. I will send a boy up with the flour and the axe on the freighter's next run north. She nodded once, gathered the working coin off the counter into her pouch, walked out of the mercantile into the light of the late afternoon. stood on the boardwalk in front of Wendell Pike's store, watched the dust move slow down the length of Silver Fork's Main Street, and she thought that a town was a strange thing, that a town could shut every door on a woman on the second morning and open half of them on the fourth afternoon, and that neither the shutting nor the opening was in the end personal. It was the ledger of a name being read for the first time. Word traveled the way word does in a town of one long street. By the time she reached the freight yard at the north end to arrange for a pack horse and a mule to be delivered as far as the trailhead, the Freywitter, a man of 59 named Elias Vance was already standing at the gate with his hat in his hand, as though he had been waiting for her to come up the boardwalk. He had known Zeke 30 years, he told her, plain, without any elaboration. He would take the two animals up to the trailhead for $2, which was half of what he charged a stranger, and he would deliver them Saturday morning, and he would carry her flour and her axe and whatever else Wendell Pike had put together, and he would not charge for the goods at all, because it did not seem right to him to charge for hauling what she was already paying to have loaded onto the same wagon. She paid him the $2, thanked him. He put his hat back on and turned to his team. Mrs. Beaumont came out of the door of the boarding house at the north end of the street as Wren walked back down toward the livery, a tin plate covered with a folded cloth in her hands. She did not stop Wren on the boardwalk, stepped down into the dust of the street, met her at the corner where the boardwalk broke for the alley behind the smithy, held the tin plate out with both hands. The cloth was still warm. Underneath it, a stack of 6 fresh biscuits and 4 thick slices of cold ham. And set into the biscuits was a fold of butter that had begun to soften from the heat of them. I ought to have opened that door on Tuesday. Mrs. Beaumont's voice was quiet, not apologetic exactly, only accurate. I was tired that morning. That is not a reason. Wren said nothing. I have a room at the back of the house that faces east. It is yours whenever weather holds you over, at whatever price you can pay, and no price at all if the price is difficult. She held the plate out farther. I would take it as a kindness if you did not refuse. Wren took the tin plate in one hand, held it a moment. I will not refuse it. Thank you, Mrs. Beaumont. Mrs. Beaumont nodded once, turned, walked back up the boardwalk to her door, did not look back. And Wren did not watch her go, and neither of them spoke of the closed door on the second morning again in the years that followed. Wren ate the biscuits and the ham, walking down the length of the street toward the livery, shared a slice of ham with the old dog pilot at her heel. And she thought that Zeke had once told her sitting by his stove on a winter evening when she was 15 that a person who could accept a plain kindness from a stranger without embarrassment had learned something most grown men never learn. And she thought he had been right, and she thought she was still learning it. An old woman waited for her at the livery gate. She stood in the shade of the roof beam with a bundle tied in flour sacking under her arm, 72 years old and thin as a fence rail, her white hair braided into a single plait down her back. Her name was Adelia Wilkes. She had been the seamstress in Silver Fork for 41 years, and she had known Ruth Callahan when Ruth Callahan was a girl of 9 in Beaver's Crossing, before the Callahans had moved north. Adelia Wilkes did not offer a greeting, held the bundle out. 2 dresses that belonged to my daughter Elma, who has grown too broad in the shoulder to wear them these last 4 years. They will fit you at the waist. They will want taking in an inch at the bust. There is a flour sacking apron folded inside them, which I stitched myself last winter, and have not had cause to use. She paused. The old sharp eyes flicked once toward the door of the livery, then back. Your mother was the neatest child in a schoolroom I ever saw. I have been sorry for 6 years that I did not write to your grandfather when I heard she had gone. Take the bundle. It is a small thing. It is what I have. Wren took the bundle, held it against her chest, said, I remember you, Mrs. Wilkes. She spoke of you. She said you gave her a peppermint stick the day she left Beaver's Crossing, and she thought about it for a week. Adelia Wilkes's face did not change. Her eyes moved once toward the doorway of the livery, then back. She said, That is a kind thing to tell an old woman. I hope it is true. It is true. I remember the way she said it. Adelia Wilkes nodded once, turned, walked back up the boardwalk toward the frame house where she had lived for 41 years. Did not look back either. And Wren watched her go with the bundle of dresses against her chest, and thought about her mother sitting at the kitchen table at Beaver's Crossing with a peppermint stick in her hand, and about the small things that carried between generations without any person ever meaning them to. Otto Kranz the blacksmith was 40 years old, a broad-chested man of German descent whose family had come west from Pennsylvania when he was 11. His forge stood behind the livery, open on 3 sides to catch the wind. The fire in the hearth banked to a red glow under a cover of ash for the middle of the afternoon when the trade was slow. He was leaning against the door of his shed with a tin cup of water in his hand when Wren came around the corner of the livery. Leading the two animals Elias Vance had brought down from the pasture behind the freight yard for her to inspect. The pack horse was a solid black gelding of about 8 years, deep in the chest, easy in the eye. The mule was a jenny of perhaps 6, sorrel-colored, with the wide, flat feet of an animal that could carry a pack over a broken ground all day without complaining. Otto Kranz set the tin cup down on a rail, walked around the two animals slow, running his hand down the fore and hind legs of each, lifting each hoof in turn, checking the frog and the wall and the heel with the practiced attention of a man who had been shoeing horses in Silver Fork since he was 20. Set the mule's hind foot down, straightened up, said, "I will shoe the both of them this afternoon. I will not take money for it." Wren said, "You will take money for it, Mr. Kranz. I can pay." Otto Kranz looked at her a long moment, said, "Your grandfather rode past my place in the middle of a snowstorm in the winter of 1879. She waited. A mare of mine had gone down in the pasture, foundered on wet grain, thrashing in the drift with a broken foreleg where she had kicked out at the fence. His voice was even, flat, the way men in that country told a thing that mattered. He put her down himself with his own rifle because I was inside with a fever and could not stand up. She stood very still. He cut the tack off her with his knife, carried the saddle and the bridle up onto my porch, set them under the eaves where they would not be ruined by the snow. He did not knock. He did not want to be thanked. I found the saddle in the morning. I did not know it was him until my wife saw him 3 months later at the mercantile, and he tipped his hat to her." Otto Kranz picked the tin cup back up, drank the last of the water in it, said, "That account has been open a long time, Miss Callahan. I would like to close some of it this afternoon." She did not argue, thanked him, sat on a wooden bench in the shade of the shed while he built the fire back up in the forge, watched him work for the better part of 2 hours, the ring of the hammer on the anvil moving in a rhythm as old as the trade itself. And she thought about Zeke riding through a snowstorm in the winter of 1879, with a rifle under his coat, and about all the accounts a quiet man could open in a small town over the course of 19 years, without ever mentioning any of them at his own kitchen table. She slept that night in the room at the back of Mrs. Beaumont's boarding house, narrow iron-frame bed with clean sheets that smelled of the wind on the line behind the kitchen. The old dog pilot slept on a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. She slept the sleep of a woman who had walked 40 miles in 4 days, and had opened in a single afternoon a series of doors she had not known were there to open. Woke before dawn to the smell of coffee coming up the back stairs. Marshal Aldous Reed rode out of Silver Fork on Friday morning with the 2 deputies from the county seat. Did not return for 8 days. Came back on the following Saturday afternoon in a slow, steady walk down the length of the main street, riding at the head of a small procession, and the whole town came out onto the boardwalks to watch him pass. 3 men tied wrist to saddle behind the deputies' horses. Rutherford Blake rode at the front of the 3, his hat gone somewhere on the trail, his beard no longer clean, his canvas coat torn at the right shoulder. The 2 men behind him were the older 2 of the 4 gentlemen who had ridden out of Silver Fork with him, the ones who had done the talking around the fire on the 2nd and 3rd nights. The 4th man from the party had run into a country he did not know when the marshal's posse had come up on the camp at first light on the morning of the 6th day. Had not come out. Reed did not in the whole of his account to Wren later spend more than 1 sentence on it. He had ridden out into broken country in the dark on a horse that was not his, and the horse had come back to the camp without him 3 hours later, and by the time the light was good enough for tracking, he was somewhere the tracking could no longer follow. Reed had ridden the country for 2 more days, had not found him, did not expect the country would give him back before spring. The marshal drew rein in front of his office at the north end of the street. His deputies swung down. The 3 prisoners were unhorsed. Reed walked into his office and came out a moment later with a length of chain and a set of iron cuffs. Chained the 3 men to the porch post of his office in the flat afternoon light, where the whole town could see them, since the county seat was 2 days south, and the wagon would not come for them until the morning. He turned to the boardwalk, saw Wren standing in front of Wendell Pike's mercantile across the street, where she had walked down from Mrs. Beaumont when the procession had come into view. Crossed the dust of the street to her. "You will want a word with him." Reed said it. It was not a question. His face was as flat as it had been Thursday afternoon in his office. "You do not have to take it. You do not have to say a thing, but it is your right, and I would not want you to reach the wagon in the morning and find you had not spoken." Wren looked past him at Rutherford Blake chained to the porch post. Blake was looking down at the boards of the porch, had not looked up when the marshal had spoken. She said, "I will take the word. I will not make it a long one." She crossed the street with the marshal at her shoulder. The old dog pilot rose from the boardwalk, followed at her heel. The town was quiet on the boardwalks. Wendell Pike had come out of his store and was standing on the step of the mercantile with his arms folded. Mrs. Beaumont stood in the door of her boarding house at the north end. Adelia Wilkes watched from the boardwalk in front of her frame house. Otto Kranz had come around the corner of the livery, still in his leather apron, the hammer still in his right hand. Wren stepped up onto the porch of the marshal's office, stopped in front of Rutherford Blake. He did not look up. "Look at me." Her voice was not raised. It carried the length of the porch anyway. Blake raised his head. His eyes met hers. She held them, did not say anything at all for a long moment, watched his face change under the weight of the silence. Said at last in the same level voice she had used on Wendell Pike's counter, on Levi Ostrand's plat book, on Aldous Reed's green ledger. "You thought I was the fourth." She let the silence hang. "I was the last." She let it hang again. "Sit with that on the ride south." She turned, walked off the porch, crossed the street back to the boardwalk in front of the mercantile. Did not look back. Blake did not answer. There was no answer that would have improved his position. And Aldous Reed walked her the last 2 steps to Wendell Pike's step with his hand light at her elbow, said quiet so that only she could hear, "That was well done." The wagon left for the county seat at first light the following morning. Wren did not go down to the street to watch it go. Did not think of Rutherford Blake again after the sound of the wheels had passed the last building of Silver Forks Main Street. Aldous Reed returned to her an hour after the wagon had gone. The paper sack of her clothes, her mother's Bible, the tin box from Zeke's mantle, and the iron skillet Zeke had bought her the year she turned 18. All of it recovered from a room above a saloon in a town 2 valleys south, where Blake had cached the belongings of the 4 women he had walked out into the country with over the course of the summer. Reed set the things on Mrs. Beaumont's kitchen table one at a time, did not offer any comment on them, tipped his hat to Mrs. Beaumont, walked out. Wren sat at the kitchen table a long moment after he had gone, opened the tin box. Inside was the folded letter Thaddeus Callahan had written her at the end of April, the receipt Mortimer Craddock had written her on the last Tuesday of July, and a small brown envelope Zeke had labeled in his own hand, "Papers." Inside the envelope was his discharge from the Army of the United States dated the spring of 1865, and a small square photograph on a card of Ruth Callahan at the age of 7, taken in a studio in Beaver's Crossing on the day of her 7th birthday, which Wren had never seen before in her life. She looked at the photograph a long time, put it back in the envelope, closed the tin box. Loaded Elias Vance's wagon at first light on Monday morning, rode up to the trailhead in the wagon beside Elias Vance with the black gelding and the sorrel mule tied behind. The old dog pilot lying at her feet in the wagon bed. She moved back into Ambrose Thorne's cabin before the first snow. Unpacked the animals into the lean-to shed she built against the south wall in the first 10 days after her return. Cleared the bench of down timber with the small axe from Wendell Pike's mercantile. Cut and stacked 4 cords of lodgepole against the west wall. Laid in salt and coffee and flour and beans and dried apples and a wheel of hard cheese. Wendell Pike had sent up in the 3rd freight to run with a note that read only, "A cabin without cheese is not a cabin at all." She rode down to Silver Fork on the first Saturday of every month. Came over the winter to be expected on the boardwalk in front of the mercantile at the hour Elias Vance's wagon pulled into the yard. Wendell Pike kept for her a running account in a small red ledger, separate from his main book. Mrs. Beaumont kept for her the room at the back of the boarding house. Adelia Wilkes set aside for her on a shelf above the washtubs a bar of hard soap wrapped in brown paper against her next visit, and never once mentioned it to her. In the second spring on a Tuesday morning in May, Aldous Reed rode up the ravine himself with a folded paper in a leather case, dismounted at the flat stone in front of the door, took his hat off, stepped inside when she opened the door, set the leather case on the plank table, drank a cup of coffee she poured him without any conversation for the first several minutes, set the cup down. The patent came through from the district office in Cheyenne last Thursday, opened the leather case, took out the folded paper, laid it on the table between them. 160 acres, signed and stamped, in your name. He put his hat back on, looked at her a moment across the table. "You have made a piece of ground into a home, Miss Callahan. It does not happen often. I thought you should hear it said." She said, "Thank you, Marshal." He drank the last of the coffee, walked out. She watched him ride down the ravine from the doorway of the cabin. Did not open the patent until his horse was out of sight. When she opened it, she sat down on the stool at the plank table and read the whole of it twice. Put the paper in the tin box on the mantel where Zeke had kept his own papers. Set her palm flat on the lid. She began to guide quietly. In the fall of that same year, hunters came out of Silver Fork in September and October, and looking for elk and mule deer in the drainages above the ridge, asked at the livery for a person who knew the country. Wick Brody sent them to her by name. She charged $4 a day and her keep, the same figure Rutherford Blake had once offered her at the yard behind the assay office. And she was worth it. And she knew it. And the men who hired her knew it. She put them on to elk on the third day of every hunt she ever ran. Dressed the animals herself in the field with the folding knife Zeke had given her on her 17th birthday. The men who watched her do it did not, after the first time, offer to help. The men from town who had once ridden past her on the boardwalk in the August of her 19th year, without seeing her, began, in the second and third year of her guiding, to take off their hats when they met her on the street of Silver Fork. Levi Ostrand, at the land office, recorded in his careful hand a second filing in her third year, this one for grazing rights on the park above the ravine, asked after her stovepipe by way of greeting when she stopped by his counter to sign the papers. In the fall of her third year in the ravine, on a cold Saturday afternoon in late October, when she had come down to Silver Fork for supplies, she saw a boy asleep behind the livery. She almost did not see him. I was curled tight against the north wall of the shed, under a piece of tarpaulin that had once been part of a freight wagon cover. A pair of boots, 2 sizes too large, set neat beside him. 12 years old, she judged, maybe a little less. His face turned toward the wall, his breath making a small thin cloud in the cold air. Wick Brody was standing in the door of the livery watching her look at the boy. His name is Corwin Ashby. Parents took the fever in a mining camp east of the Divide back in July. He rode it in with a freighter 3 weeks ago. Has been sleeping behind the shed since. I feed him what I can. He will not stay in the boarding house. Will not go to the church. Will not talk to Reed. Won't talk to anybody much. Wren looked at Wick. Wick looked at Wren. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Wren walked over to the boy, knelt down slow on the packed dirt beside him. Did not touch him, said, quiet. Corwin. The boy did not open his eyes, but his breathing changed. Corwin, look at me. He opened his eyes, pale gray, wary, older than the 12 years of his face. I have got a cabin up in a ravine you have never heard of. There is a stove that draws clean, and a spring that runs cold in August, and an old dog who could use a boy to throw sticks for him. The boy said nothing. I need a hand this winter. I cannot pay you money. I can teach you to pack a mule, and to shoot a rifle straight, and to read the weather in the aspens before a storm. The boy watched her. She waited. Then she said, You do not have to answer me now. I am at Mrs. Beaumont's until Monday morning. If you come by the boarding house before then, I will take you up. If you do not come, I will not come looking. It is your choice to make. She stood up, walked back to the livery door, did not look back. Monday morning at first light, when she came down the back stairs of Mrs. Beaumont's with her bundle on her shoulder, Corwin Ashby was sitting on the boardwalk in front of the boarding house. The boots 2 sizes too large on his feet, a small canvas sack in his lap. He did not speak. He rose when she came out, fell in beside her, walked with her the length of the main street to the freight yard, where Elias Vance had the wagon loaded and ready. Elias looked at the boy, looked at Wren, did not say a word, made room on the seat. Corwin climbed up between them. The old dog pilot lay down at his feet in the wagon bed, rested his gray muzzle on the boy's boot. Late one afternoon in the middle of her 4th summer in the ravine, sitting at the plank table in the doorway of the cabin with a tin cup of coffee cooling in her hand and the light of the sun coming down across the bench in long slanting bars. Wren opened the leather ledger that had once been Ambrose Thorne's, turned to the back where the sealed letter was folded into the binding, unfolded the letter one more time, read it through slowly, from the first line to the last, refolded it, set it back inside the ledger, took from the pocket of the coat she wore, which was still Zeke's coat, though she had patched it twice at the elbows and once along the hem, the 2 small brass compasses, one with the letters ZC and the date 1863 engraved on the back of its case, its glass scratched in a long thin line from north to south, the other with the same letters, the same date, its glass unscratched, its case only lightly worn. She set them on the plank table beside the folding knife, with its bone handle worn to the color of old cream. The 3 objects lay side by side on the wood, She looked at them a long moment in the failing light. Zeke had carried the knife strapped inside his coat through the winter campaigns of 1864. Had given it to her on a windless April morning when she was 17. She had carried it every day of the 6 years since. And the smooth bone was worn a shade smoother now than it had been the day he had put it in her hand. Zeke had carried the older compass through the second river crossing in the December of 1863. Had left it in the hands of a man he had known for perhaps 2 hours by the fire of an army camp. And Ambrose Thorne had kept the compass in a fold of blue wool for 19 winters, without ever finding the man to return it to, and the compass had come down to her, through the two of them. Through the hands of two men who had in their separate and unspoken ways cared enough to keep the small things that mattered to another person safe against a return they were no longer certain would come. Outside the cabin door. The old dog pilot lay on the threshold stone, his pale milky eye half open, watching the shape of the bench without seeming to watch it at all. At the far end of the bench in the last of the sun, Corwin Ashby was splitting kindling with the small axe. 13 years old now. Already a hand taller than he had been the October morning, she had knelt down beside him behind the livery. The ring of the axe on the pine came back off the walls of the ravine in a rhythm she had heard once before. At a woodshed above Silver Fork. The last afternoon of April, in the year she was 17. Zeke had been out there splitting kindling in the same rhythm. She had been in the kitchen with a needle in her hand, and they had sat down at the plank table together an hour later. And he had put a canvas-wrapped bundle in front of her, and her whole life had turned on the smooth bone handle of the knife inside it. Wren rose from the stool, walked out to the threshold stone, stood in the doorway watching Corwin work in the last of the light, said aloud quiet to the empty room behind her, and to the ravine in front of her, and to no one at all. The ground remembers, it keeps, and every so often for the person patient enough to look, it gives back what a decent stranger once tried to save. The wind came up off the spring at the north end of the bench, moved through the pines above the cabin with the soft, steady sound she had come to know as the shape of an evening on her own ground. Corwin set the axe down, gathered an armload of split kindling, walked toward the cabin. The old dog pilot rose slow from the threshold stone, pressed his gray muzzle once against Wren's knee, and she thought. The men who had ridden away from her at the head of an empty drainage in the August of her 19th year had thought they were leaving a girl with no witness, in country she could not walk out of. They had left her instead to her own country, and to Zeke's country, and to Ambrose Thorne's country. They had left her to a plank table and a stone hearth and a tin box under the floor. And to 160 acres of ground she had made her own, by the plain steady work of two hands, into a name that men in Silver Fork took their hats off to when they met her on the street. And they had left her without meaning to a boy who would grow up knowing how to pack a mule, and how to read the weather in the turning of a leaf, and how to sit still until he knew what to do next. Because a man named Ezekiel Callahan had once taught a girl those same things, and she had lived long enough, and she had healed enough to pass them on. She turned from the doorway. Corwin came up the step with the kindling in his arms. She held the door open for him. He went inside. The old dog pilot followed him in, and Wren Callahan stood one more moment on the threshold stone of the cabin she had come to on foot with $11 folded flat in the lining of her right boot, looked out across the bench in the last of the summer light, thought that the road she thought was hers had closed behind her on a Thursday afternoon. And the road that had opened in front of her, because she had the eyes to see it and the legs to walk it, had carried her into a country she had not known she was being made for. She closed the door and went in to make supper for her boy.